Good afternoon and welcome to the Preservation Association of Lincoln Brown Bag Lecture Series. My name is Eileen Burke and I'm the coordinator of these brown bags. Our lecture today is sponsored by Speedway Properties. If you're interested in these programs, please join our membership. You can go to preservelincoln.org to find the membership forms. Our speaker today is Jim McKee. Jim is a lifelong Lincolnite. His great-grandparents pioneered in Lancaster County in the 1870s. Jim has a bachelor's degree from UNL and operates J&L Lee Company and publisher of regional books and as well as a coinery. Jim has written over 1,500 articles and books on Lincoln and Nebraska history. He serves on the City of Lincoln Historic Preservation Commission, and he's also a founding member of the Preservation Association of Lincoln. This is the 38th in a series of talks that are titled Jim McKee's Complete History of Lincoln. Please join me in welcoming Jim McKee.
Well, we have varying things today, and the first things we will talk about is one of my favorites, the old hump yard, or the Coddington Bridge and Hump Yard. This photograph is a little bit later than the Coddington Bridge, so we'll have to use your imagination a little bit. When the Burlington and Missouri River Railroad reached the city of Lincoln in 1870, we look at the original map and it shows the railroad coming in at an angle and literally ending in what we think of as about P Street today. And the area around it was all covered with houses, little businesses, and nothing to do with the railroad whatsoever. Probably when they got here, they really didn't think of Lincoln as any more than just a sort of a by road or a pass road getting through Lincoln and heading towards the west. And in fact, 6 years later, by 1876, there were only two tracks running through what we call the downtown depot yard today. Then in another 6 years, we find a 5-stall roundhouse has been built, which was off to the northeast of where we now think of the old depot as being. And one has to be careful because old depot has a whole new connotation now because we have a new depot. But the old depot, which still stands in the middle of the Haymarket, the roundhouse stood to the north and just a tiny bit to the east of there. Then by 1880, it began to really transform itself. We had 8 parallel tracks and a 20-stall roundhouse, again off towards the north and a little bit to the east of the old depot. Lincoln was growing in importance, and they felt it was needed, was more than just the small roundhouse and the depot. So they began looking, I should say, for where else they might expand the railroad. And by 1905, they had sort of narrowed it down to a few sites. One of them was Burnham. Burnham was a city which city is an expansion of a word. It was more not even a village, but it did have a post office called Burnham. Burnham was located literally across the street from the Yankee Hill Brickyards offices, slightly to the east and slightly to the south of there. And not so many years, the Burnham post office was still being used as a chicken coop down there, but not much is left of Burnham. That was one of the spots. And at Burnham, they actually had a stockyard, which was a very large stockyard. So this was one of the potential places. And as Yankee Hill Brickyard is expanding, it made some sense to put it there. Havelock, of course, had a very large area. With, at that time, considerable empty land around it, but with its growing so rapidly, they sort of left that aside too. Then northwest of the depot was primarily where the roundhouse was, but then it began interfering with the University of Nebraska, which is also growing quite quickly. So they settled on some land to the southwest. They chose it, 1, it was cheap, 2, it was pretty much flat, and it was empty. So this is the land they're going to settle on. This is going to be about 2+ miles to the southwest of where the depot is today. They had planned a 40-stall roundhouse, which will be just about a complete roundhouse. And they're going to put in a hump yard. And a hump yard is one in which the cars coming in are sorted, and you can see them being sorted in this much later picture. It's a very efficient means of sorting cars because it employs gravity, and gravity costs us practically nothing to operate. However, it utilizes a larger number of employees than would be necessary if we're going to shift cars and use the same sort of layout, but use mechanical means to disperse the cars. But in this instance, we're going to have a hump yard, which will be several miles long in an east-west configuration. In this picture, we have east at the top, which is kind of unusual. The dead center of the hump yard would be roughly, I said dead center and then roughly, the dead center would be J Street, and you can see it just at the top, the Capitol building, so it isn't precisely J Street, but close enough. And the way it works is, at the bottom of the picture, cars come in at an area which is roughly 10 feet higher in elevation than the basin, which they call right here. So a car comes in at the top, and it is released, and gravity lets it flow down there, and then through a series of switches, what starts as one track or two tracks ultimately goes to what multiply would become 30-some car tracks. So we can build 30-some trains. The car is released, and then through a series of levers, the car is moved left or right until it hits the back of the train they're trying to build. Very efficient. The hump yard opened in December of 1909, and by 1942, which is just before the war, they were handling 1/8 of a million cars per year through the yard. They needed to expand, however, for World War II, and this is going to be a problem because they're going to have to work around the hump yard as it existed and build it and work around it. It's sort of like having an operation going on you while your heart's still beating, or like trying to work on your car with the engine still running, but it had to be done. Ultimately, there will be 36 parallel tracks, 65 miles of tracks within the bowl area. 290 switches, which will operate to bring the cars into wherever they need to go. At the height of the wartime effort, there were about 800 cars per shift, not per day, but per shift, being handled through the freight yard. Then in 1983, they reduced the 10-foot drop down to about 5 feet, and the two towers, which is where primarily most of these switches were located, they were both closed, and they started using it completely differently. They would sort the cars by pushing them with moving cars, diesel cars, which are not nearly as efficient, of course, because you're going to have to use diesel fuel. An example of this becomes, if you can think of in the Haymarket district where Laszlo's is, the old hotel, which is the building that is now Laszlo's, has a fire escape on the western face of the building. I believe it's a 3-story building. That fire escape used to have, when you would get to the first level or the ground floor, the last leg of the fire escape would be like this, and when you stepped on it, it would go down and hit the sidewalk. But the fire department did not like that, and in fact, they actually said in public, what happens if gravity fails? Well, it's sort of the same thing with the hump yard. What if gravity fails? We wouldn't be able to use that 10-foot drop. So we're going to move cars by diesel. And what they did with the Haymarket is they took that fire escape and fixed it to the sidewalk so that if gravity ever fails, you won't have to worry about that coming down. Good to know, right? So at this point in time, by the 1890s, we're also going to need one other thing at the hump yard, and that is not shown in this picture. This is a fairly recent colored photograph, maybe from a drone, I'm not sure, which shows the bypass highway kind of cutting across the middle of the dish at an angle. But back in the 1890s, we're having a couple of problems occur with the railroad. And it's starting on O Street. If you were coming down the DLD highway, which was O Street, and headed towards the west, When you got to about 10th Street, you would cross the first track. Actually, the furthest east track only went to P Street because it took paper and ink to the Lincoln Journal building. But as soon as you got past that one, you begin to have a lot of spurs as well as the main line of the railroads going through. And at one point, I counted 37 parallel north-south tracks between the Lincoln Journal siding and other sidings and main tracks till you got to the other side. 37, which means if you're in an automobile and you're headed west on O Street, you had the potential of having to stop 37 times on your way to Grand Island. Well, obviously that couldn't go on. And in 1895, we'll build the first overpass. And the same problem will be starting to exist here on Coddington Avenue, which would be the left and right or north and south street, which would cross over the bowl. But what very few people realized was that Coddington Bridge did not belong to the county or the city. It was actually put up strictly for the use of the railroad. And so those of us who are old enough to remember it, remember this bridge which didn't quite exactly line up with Coddington. You had to go just a little bit like this to get on, and then on the other end a little bit off. Coddington Avenue did not line up with it because the railroad did not want traffic over that bridge. They had to maintain it. They were responsible for that bridge. And probably there were legal liabilities involved in it too. And they did not maintain it. And they purposely did not maintain it because they didn't want traffic on it. But nonetheless, when I was a kid, probably say in the late 40s and the 1950s, one of the favorite things we liked to do is if we'd come back from Pioneers Park, we'd convince my father to drive over that bridge. Rickety bridge, wooden planks over a steel framework. And then the idea was to stop dead in the middle of it, which would be J Street, and sit there and watch the cars coming, floating down as if by magic from the west, and then kabang, as they would hit the car in front of it. They would self-couple it that way. So you'd be sitting there, bang, 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 bang. And you could tell when you're right exactly in the middle of the bridge, which is where you wanted to stop, because there was a sign that said, absolutely no stopping at this point, because that was J Street. So it was a great fun. But as I said, it's not going to be deemed to last forever. So that explains a couple of things: why the bridge didn't line up and why it was made of wood instead of something else. Well, today, of course, they still use this yard. It's not called a hump yard anymore. We call it a classification yard. And a classification yard is like the largest classification yard in the world is in North Platte. And this is a classification card. In other words, it sorts cars into trains. And you can still go over a bridge which is roughly where the old Coddington Bridge was. Not precisely, but if you stop in the middle of that bridge today to look down J Street, you're going to probably get smacked about 8 times because it is a highway. It's a very, very scrupulously paved bridge as well. Went backwards. Okay. The University of Nebraska. Why is it in Lincoln? How was it located in Lincoln? The acting governor of Nebraska, right after our first governor, who only lasted a few days in office, acting Governor Cumming was very interested in establishing a university or university systems in the state, at that time the territory, as early as 1854. Incorporations became very popular. Land promoters were eager to have a University of Nebraska in their town, or at least in paper, because it enabled them to sell lots easier and for higher profit. At one point in time, there were so many universities being formed on paper, or incorporated at least, that one person said all they did was they had a blank sheet, and all you did was fill it in, and it automatically went through the legislature. Not quite true, but there were certainly a lot of them. For example, in 1855, Nebraska University, not University of Nebraska, but Nebraska University, was incorporated in Cass County, followed by the University of Nebraska at Saratoga. Saratoga was an up-and-coming community. I would peg it easily for you just north on the Missouri River from Omaha, but not as far as Florence. And it was there that there is a sulfur springs, which they were going to use for building a hotel and a spa around it. And for a while, it looked like Saratoga was destined to become a major shipping point or a stopping point on the Missouri River. Didn't work out, but they did build the University of Nebraska building there, used variously as a hotel, and later became Talbot Brownell School, which was ultimately moved out of there and into Omaha. October of 1858, two more University of Nebraskas, one at Fontanelle. Fontanelle being on the other side of Omaha, were incorporated at that point in the time. And the legislature, meantime, repealed the earlier ones. So it was a come-and-go situation. One tried to form the University of Nebraska. Maybe my favorite was the University of Nebraska at Wyoming. That one didn't see the light of day. Wyoming was at that time a city, was on the Missouri River. And if you would go straight out O Street and hit Union, Nebraska, and turn right and head for Nebraska City, after you turn to the right, on the east side of that road, you will still to this day find a sign which says Old Wyoming Campground. And that is the site of the village, if you will, of Wyoming. Wyoming's going to move, so we had an Old Wyoming and a New Wyoming, but Old Wyoming was actually a very successful town. It had hotels, it had a newspaper, and it was a major stopping point, primarily where the Mormons were also crossing there, as well up as at Winter Quarters, or North Omaha. Many were crossing there to get to the Oregon Trail. Ultimately, they would cross at Nebraska City, they would cross at Wyoming, they cross above Omaha, and so forth. This was one of the major spots. Unfortunately, and it probably would have worked out, but the Missouri River, as it was wont to do at that time, picked up and moved to the east. And in so doing, the town of Wyoming was abandoned. All that's left of it now, supposedly you can still find foundations. There was a fairly good-sized cemetery, which, as far as I know, was not even marked anymore. The old Wyoming campgrounds is on the site. Then they moved Wyoming over into the state a little bit further to the west to be on the railroad, but that also is abandoned now. At any rate, one wag at this point in time said, so many people in so many legislative districts wanted the University of Nebraska in their town. He said, why don't we do this a little differently? We'll call it the University of Nebraska on wheels. And every year we'll move it, so everybody can have it for a year at least. Obviously, that was just a folly. 1862, the Morrill Act was passed, which provided that states or territories could receive 30,000 acres of federal land within their area per U.S. senator and representative. Doesn't follow as well in a territory, but that would have given, had it worked, would have given Nebraska 90,000 acres of federal land within the area. But one of the requirements at that time was that this land that they gave then to Nebraska territory or state, you could sell that land, but you could not use the money to build buildings. So it was not that handy. With statehood, Nebraska received another 46,000 acres of land, federal lands within the state. So we're going to have a means of financing the university. Then in 1867, as statehood became more imminent, our friend J. Sterling Morton in Nebraska City decided that he would support the Omaha site for the state capital, figuring a trade-off on it. Politics was alive and well in 1866, 1867 as it is today. He figured that if he threw his support behind Omaha for the capital, that Omaha would reciprocate and give Nebraska City the site of the University of Nebraska. Aha, well, that didn't work out so well. Mr. Morton had a couple of other ideas. One of them was at one point for everything in Nebraska to the south of the Platte River would separate from Nebraska and join Kansas. Unfortunately, or fortunately, Kansas wanted no part of it. They didn't want that, and it never went anyplace either. So we're ultimately, Omaha still thinks maybe they should have the state capital. And they figured that because the territorial capital had been located at the top of Capitol Avenue, when and if the capital did move out, which it obviously was going to, that then the state of Nebraska would give the original capital site to the city of Omaha, which would become the site for the University of Nebraska. That didn't work out either. But Omaha did get roughly a square block of land at the top of Capitol Avenue. And they hoped at that point in time to use the old territorial capitol building as a high school. But the building was in such poor repair, if you remember from earlier programs, it was literally falling down from the day it was built, that they had to tear it down and build the first Omaha high school in there. Later it will be replaced with Omaha Central, which is still there. So they thought there would be a cost savings and that Omaha would recover. Didn't happen. Meanwhile, our friend Augustus Harvey, who was the non-member of the Capitol Commission who came with them to seek a site for the capital AL and ultimately capital OL in Lincoln, he will draw the original plat of the city of Lincoln in 1867, accepted August 15th. Lancaster will become Lincoln. And one of the things he set aside in the original plat was a roughly 10-acre plot, 4 square blocks of land, which would be block 58, if you will turn to your plat book, which was the University of Nebraska, often referred to as University Place, which really confounds people a little bit later on because University Place goes from being that 4 square block to a street called University Place, which becomes U Street, and then pretty soon we have a city called University Place. So complicated, but nonetheless. He will also indicate 2 other 4 square block tracts of land on that same plat. One of them will be for Lincoln Park, which today we know of as Cooper Park. The other one will be the site of the state capitol building. So we have 3 10-acre or 4 square block, roughly 10 acres, and they're not exactly the same because he didn't have all the streets the same width. A street heading into the university, for example, was slightly wider. O Street was slightly wider. Street going into any major place was a little wider. And he, for somehow or another, saw the 3 10-acre sites as a triangle, and you can't have 3 sites hardly without either being a straight line or a triangle, but it was not much of a triangle. I believe the university site was about 9.5 acres, so that became the University of Nebraska in the original plat. Several people pointed out that it was probably not a very good place to put the university. One of them was quoted as saying that it wasn't a good spot because it was flat as a board. They had avoided the beautiful area, the gentle slopes of Antelope Creek, and instead chosen a spot which was full of nothing but buffalo beans, wild grass, cattle wandering around, and mud. And one of the people that's credited with that was Willa Cather, but I can't be sure that it was actually her quote. The Omaha Herald pointed at that time that they were still hoping that the University of Nebraska would come to Omaha, but obviously that's not going to happen. The University of Nebraska then was chartered February 15th, 1869. Again, August Harvey is the guy that's going to be the author of that document. And within 2 years, we'll have the school opening here. As the building itself deteriorates, there's a possibility it will move from Lincoln, and Nebraska City steps up to the plate and says, the University of Nebraska, if you would move it to Nebraska City, where the university belongs anyway, we would build for the university at our expense a fine stone building, which would replace this one. Omaha, of course, jumped on the bandwagon and offered to build a university as well. Turns out Nebraska City didn't ultimately fare too well, but Omaha University will become part of the University of Nebraska, so ultimately they're going to do all right. They're going to get the University of Nebraska kind of anyway. I keep pushing the wrong button. There's one thing you can't get wrong. the University of Nebraska and its astronomy division. Almost at once, the University of Nebraska, as soon as they got going, offered classes in astronomy, but they didn't have a separate department. By 1871, they were taught by whatever professor was available. By 1888, they had formalized it a little bit. They had an astronomy department within the physics department. And at that point in time, Professor Brace, whose name gets on the Brace building on the University of Nebraska, Brace Physics, I think it's called, has gone to Lincoln, and he has contracted with a jeweler in Lincoln on O Street, J.B. Trickey, whose address was 1035 O Street, which would put it pretty much within the site of the current terminal building. He contracted with Mr. Trickey to buy a telescope for the university. In the meantime, a man by the name of Gordon DeLoss Sweezy came to the university, but not University of Nebraska. He came to Doane University at that point in time in Crete in 1881. Then later, he will become part of the Nebraska Weather Service, which is a subdivision of the U.S. Weather Service, which will move to the city of Lincoln. In the meantime, he will have established at Doane the Boswell Astronomical Observatory, which is still there. The last time I knew, the telescope was still in it, but whether they use it or not, I am not sure. But it's still there. At any rate, when the university accepts the Weather Service here, Sweezy moves to Lincoln and becomes the director of the Weather Service. And its office will primarily originally be in Maine University building. He lived in a house which was one of hundreds of houses, literally. But his house was located about where the military, naval and science building is located today. So we don't think of the university campus being dotted with literally hundreds of little houses, but in fact it was at that point in time. He was made then also professor of meteorology and astronomy. 2 years later, the regents will authorize $400, then $500 for the construction of an observatory. Temporary, it was said. And at that point in time, Mr. Sweezy then contacted a man in Palmer, Nebraska, Dr. Charles Minnick. And he contracted with him to grind a lens for a new telescope, which the doctor said he would do free of charge. Pretty good deal. In the meantime, the engineering department assigned students and faculty to build a building, which was completed in 1896, on 12th Street. As near as I can tell, this would probably be just to the edge, the north edge of Sheldon Art Gallery, somewhere in that neighborhood. And this is where the 4-inch telescope was finally installed. By 1906, the new lens, which was coming, was done, and Sweezy convinced the university to move that building over to 10th Street, and this is the 10th Street property. The 12th Street property was so temporary, I don't even have a picture of it, but at least this is the one that it was built on 10th Street, just south of Brace Laboratory. Again, Mr. Brace's name comes up. Mr. Sweezy then draws himself plans for a $12,500 building, which will accommodate this new telescope, which is being ground by Dr. Palmer. Unfortunately, the university didn't put any funds aside for it, so Mr. Sweezy will wrap the lens after he receives it in silk and store it in what then had become the university's steam tunnels, which were beginning to radiate all over from the steam plant. Ultimately, they will reach as far as the Capitol building. And although I think the tunnel is still there, is it not, Matt? It's not used to transport steam or chilled water anymore, as far as I know. Does anything go through it at all? For a while, they also were furnishing direct current to the Capitol building, but as far as I know, nothing.
We're not, we're with the well field going in, we're giving off to the university's chilled water, and we've got our own supply.
Okay, Matt says that we have their own source of chilled water, heating water, and electricity, so nothing comes through the tunnel?
I mean, there's pipes there, but they're not.
There's pipes.
Serving that.
So you and I could still crawl along there if we wanted to. I see a road trip here for PAL, frankly. No. Our insurance agent just says no. Okay. Well, that first year, they had an observatory. They said they had 76 students signed up for astronomy classes. It seems a little bit unlikely that the number was that big, but we can't argue with it. It was written down, therefore it must be true. 1929, a new observatory was considered. They thought that they could raise $15,000 to build it, but that year, 1929, gives you an idea of what was happening. The Great Depression was happening, and it went nowhere. 1932, Mr. Swayze, at age 81, which seems like a kid to me now, decided to retire at age 81. Some said that he was forced into retirement to save the university money, but at age 81, I suspicion he was probably ready to retire. The Daily Nebraskan at that point said, and I quote, "He was sacrificed in an attempt to balance a heartless budget," end of quote. Could the university ever be said to do that again? I don't know. Well, at that point in time, of course, interest in astronomy declined, and the number of students declined. The department was ultimately absorbed by the math department, and a man by the name of Professor Collins took over. The old observatory, which we see here, was never intended to be a permanent structure, and it just continued to deteriorate. And then in 1935, they decided to build a new observatory on the east campus, so it was ultimately torn down. And a 12-inch reflector telescope was built, roughly where the C.Y. Thompson Library is now, but roughly in that area. The old observatory here on 10th Street stood until 1951, when it finally more or less fell down and was raised. Then in the 1960s, the late 1960s, the astronomy department again became a separate department. And they decided to put a nude observatory outside the city of Lincoln, where lights were becoming a problem, on the old World War II Army Ordnance Depot at Meade, Nebraska. And they called on Walt Balin of Columbus to help finance it. And he caused to be built a 24-inch lens. And an old Army building on the campus was used for classroom. And the observatory, the Balin Observatory, as known, was completed in 1971, dedicated in 1973. And it had a 30-inch Böhler-Chivens telescope. The dedication at that time claimed, and I have a hard time with this one as well, that it was one of the 4 largest telescopes in the United States, which, if memory serves me, Palomar is a 200-inch telescope. But anyway, that's what it said. And they had the president of the American Astronomical Society there in 73, along with the heads of the astronomy departments at MIT, Cornell, and Caltech came for the dedication. Now, there's one interesting thing which you will notice if you are observant. When you're on the connection to the interstate headed out towards the airport, you will notice there, just across the street west from the Memorial Stadium, there is a parking garage, and there on top of it, incongruously, is a astronomical observatory. And I thought, how can that be when we need to really get out of the light pollution within the city of Lincoln? But I checked, and sure enough, it is used as an astronomical observatory. At least it was until a few years ago when I last checked. But the question is, whatever happened to Mr. Minnick's lens that he stored in the steam tunnels? His son ultimately offered a $5,000 reward for anyone figuring out where that lens ended up. Never found it. Don't know. So you might want to check in your basement and see if it turns up, but we just don't know. $15,000 lens, it just has to be someplace because the glass wouldn't have deteriorated, but it's gone. Elizabeth Dolan, an interesting lady, known primarily probably for her painting The Spirit of the Prairie, which is in the State Capitol building, we think of mostly. But also, I think of her at the old Morrill Hall Museum as well. And many people are quick to point out that Masonic Temple also has a good number of her paintings in them. Very difficult lady to trace her early childhood. Her parents immigrated from Ireland. She was born in Fort Dodge, Iowa. We don't even know for sure when she was born. 4 different biographies I've read of hers. One of them states as early as 1871. One bizarrely has her in 1887, which is far too late. But I can't be absolutely sure. What I should do is look up her obituary. Probably would find out a little bit more. They moved, the Dolans and their daughter moved to Tecumseh, Nebraska when she was a baby. She enrolled in the University of Nebraska in 1891-92. Then she disappeared for a couple years, and then she came back and entered again in 1894. Later on, her sister said of her that probably the 1871 birth date was a little more accurate than of the others. But at any rate, she did finally take art classes with Sarah Hayden, who we think of today with the Hayden Art Gallery as well. The mother taught at Park School. The father apparently passed away. She lived at 1320 D Street in 1895. That's about all we know about her then. Another unexplained gap. She enrolled in the Chicago Art Institute in 1912 as a scholarship student, graduated there in 1914. And one of her teachers there called her the most talented student he had ever had. She is very good, obviously. Then she spent 3 years at the Art Institute League in New York City. Then she attended the Julian Academy in Paris. From there, she went to the Conservatoire Américain Fontainebleau near Paris. And ultimately, in 1925, she begins designing windows for the Tiffany Glass Company. So a very, very wild, or varied, I should say, career. Then studied briefly at the Paris Salon in 1926. She received a series of commissions to do the backdrops for the exhibits in Morrill Hall. And many of those are still there to this day. So she returned to Lincoln at that time in 1937. 1926, excuse me, living at 1637 D Street. And those paintings, which you can still see, were all affixed directly to the wall. They weren't painted on canvas, which was affixed to the wall. They were painted on the wall. And it allowed her to use a technique in fresco painting because it was a textured wall of plaster. She was able to texture her paintings with the texture of the plaster underneath, giving them what she called a three-dimensional aspect. I've never noticed it, but apparently she thought it was there. At that time, it was noted that she was, and I quote, probably the only woman in the country practicing the lost art of fresco painting. Don't know what that means exactly, but it's a quote, so it's good for something. Then Bertrand Grosvenor Goodhue begins to hire works of various means for the Capitol building, and he is told that he will have to put them out for bid, and he says, you mean like plumbers? He fights that very hard. And Elizabeth Dolan became the second artist he will hire. Augustus Van Vincent Tack is the first one, but she becomes the second one. And her work, The Spirit of the Prairie, is the one which most often we think of. I think that's the next one up. I can't. No, that is not The Spirit of the Prairie. It is an Elizabeth Dolan. This happened to be on the wall of the house that Professor Knoll lived on 24th Street. Her painting in the State Library on the north wall above and sort of surrounding the door is the one that's called The Spirit of the Prairie. She literally gave it to the state of Nebraska. She charged the state $85 for paint, $25 for canvas, and 2 months' living expenses at $200. So literally her gift to the state. And the only way to see that one is to go into the state library, go through the door, and then turn around and look back up. And it is a spectacular painting. A mother, a baby in her arms, a boy, and a dog at their feet. Perfectly placed because it's completely out of the way of sunlight. So it does not get faded or at all. Beautiful. 1930, she sold Miller and Payne 10 works of art for their art collection, which they were building at that point in time. The one which I remember, and I don't have a picture of it, it was in the ladies' what would they call it? Ladies' lounge area. And if you walked by, you could look in and see it, which everyone did, you could see it above the wall, was kind of just in the first part of the lounge. There was then, when Miller and Payne closed, it was offered for sale. I have no idea what they offered it for, but Governor Kay Orr said the state of Nebraska should buy that painting. And she convinced them to do it. It was first hung in the state office building. Then it moved to John Breslow's office, then to Supreme Court Ladies Lounge, which, again, I'll look at Matt, is it still hanging there?
It's actually in the Attorney General's reception room currently.
Okay. In the governor's reception room?
Attorney General.
Attorney General, so that would have been Breslow's office again. 1932, she accepted a commission to paint a mural for the American Museum of Natural History in New York. And at that time, she maintained her artist gallery and maybe lived as well in her gallery. It's a little unclear. The city directory shows her residence there at 13th and P in the Lansing Theater, which became the Varsity Theater building a little bit later on. And at that point in time, I think Bob Ribley told me that he thought she probably did live in her office as well. She was painting at that time and selling her paintings through a local paint store. By that, I don't mean an artist paint store, but like Cook's Paints. And you could buy an Elizabeth Dolan original for the astounding amount of $5. And surely she sold a lot of them, but where did they end up? I have no idea. Through the years, she was also commissioned to do the University Student Union, some paintings for them. The YWCA in New York City, the YMCA in Lincoln, the Unitarian Lincoln, New York World's Fair, the University Club in Lincoln, and the Lincoln Public Library. Some of those paintings we know specifically have been destroyed. Some of them in Morrill Hall were literally destroyed. Others of them have been covered over. But in Morrill Hall you still see a large number of them, and there are 10 paintings in the Masonic Hall, 9 up above in their sort of meeting room, and 1 in the lobby. She was known at the time as a strikingly red-haired, chain-smoking young lady. The Harris House. Interestingly enough, that was probably Mr. Harris's house, and Mr. Harris never lived in the house, sort of. Have to look below the surface a little bit. As the railroads built through Nebraska, particularly from the east, railroads like the Union Pacific and the Burlington, Missouri River Railroad received from the federal government, state government, county governments, city governments, and others literally huge amounts of land to encourage them to build through the state, come to your county, come to your city, and so forth. But all of this land which they had was worthless to them unless it was sold. They really needed the cash because the railroad would just be a pencil-thin line through this land. One of the people that was in charge of this sales was a man by the name of George Samuel Harris. He was a land agent. He first came to Missouri in 1863, where he worked the Hannibal and St. Joseph, Missouri Railroad, which was the first railroad to actually reach the Missouri River. Then the following year, he came to Lincoln, where he established one of the land offices for the Burlington, Missouri River Railroad. So that would have been in the early depot down in the middle of the Haymarket area. He also formed an interlocking relationship with the Hannibal and St. Joseph Railroad, which had 300,000 acres of land in the general area of Nebraska. The Harris family themselves moved first to Iowa in 1870, and then in 1872 they moved to Lincoln, and their house was listed as the north side of K Street between 16th and 17th Street, and they built a house in 1872, 1610 K Street. We'd like to think this is the house, but in a way it is, and in a way it isn't, because unfortunately Mr. Harris narrowly missed being killed in a shipwreck off Rhode Island, but he did die literally from being weakened from that in 1874, just 2 years later. So his wife then is going to occupy the original house. During his lifetime, George Harris was credited with selling 100,000 acres of land to immigrants, primarily in St. Joseph Railroad, then 600,000 acres of land in Missouri for the Hannibal and St. Joseph, then 360,000 in Nebraska and Iowa. And he was also probably, when contacted by a man by the name of Mr. Doane, was responsible for the large land grant to what became Doane University in Crete, Nebraska. Then after his death, Sarah, who was living in the house, at the urging of her children, expanded the house and built around the house. And this is what it looked like. Probably about 1901, it was when the last enlargement was made, a 2.5-story house, which is the way you would recognize it. It was the northeast corner of 16th and K. Then when Sarah passed away, it passed to her daughter, who, interestingly enough, was also named Sarah, which complicates things until she marries a physician by the name of Dr. Alvis, whose last name was Doris, so she becomes Sarah Doris. When she died in 1918, the house became the Alpha Tau Omega fraternity. They moved into the house. Then First Christian Church purchased the property. They have had a couple of locations in Lincoln, and they will purchase it and begin building a house there. And at that point in time, 2 students who were members of the fraternity and later architects, John and George, brothers, John and George Unthank, will move the house to the east to 1630 K Street, where it still stands today. So if it does look familiar, that's it. To the left of this or to the west would be First Christian Church. The fraternity will have sold the house. It becomes a private dwelling at this point again. Then it's converted into 13 apartments. Then it goes back in 1984 to an office building, which at that time also had an antique store in it. And now it is, as far as I know, all office building. I'm not sure. For a while, Polly McMullen had an office clear up in the top up there where the gable or the peak is up there at the very top. Then his son, John F. Harris, graduated from the University of Nebraska, and he goes back to New York and starts a brokerage house. And in 1926, it was he who oversaw the original purchase of 500 acres of land for what is first going to be known, or thought to be, they were going to name it Harris Park. But he said, no, let's not name it Harris Park. Let's name it for all pioneers instead. So it became Pioneers Park, and then as sort of a thank you to him, when they built the O Street Viaduct, the first one, it became known as the Harris Overpass. So Harris' name lived on, but not in the park. The house is still there. As I said, George never lived in this house because it was just a small part of this house at that point in time. Another house, which I love to look at old houses, and this is the photograph of the house, and this would be the architect's drawing for the house. We're not far from standing in this house right now. It was built by a man by the name of Lorenzo Billingsley, who came to Lincoln in 1874, at the time when Lincoln had a population of about 7,000 people. He was an attorney, and his offices were at number 8 O Street. And I have unsuccessfully tried to figure out how they numbered properties in Lincoln. And I don't know if Ed has figured it out. He's never told me. I think he may know, but he just isn't passing the information on just yet. At some point, that information will become available, and he will be highly remunerated for it. In some cities, that number 8 would mean it was the 8th property built on O Street. I have no idea what it meant, number 8 O Street. He was then elected to the city council. He lived at that point in time, 1024 J Street. Then he bought the lots shown here on the northwest corner of 10th and H Streets. And if you stop and think about it, that's just literally the foot of this expanded building would be where that house sits now. In the meantime, a man by the name of Montgomery will buy a couple of lots at 11th and N Streets, and he will pay $14,000 for 2 lots, which just a couple of years earlier had sold for $30 at a sheriff's sale. So there was a great deal of markup involved in there. And he will build the first portion of this building, which will become first the Billingsley, then the Billingsley-Montgomery building. It was there until the early 1970s. I'm not sure the exact date. The last tenant in there that I know of was on one of the upper floors. You gained entrance by going through a central door, and I did. Whenever a building looks like it's about ready to fall down, I seem to be drawn to it, and I did go in. There was only one thing in the upper floor at that point in time, and that was our old friend who seems to be the last occupant of a lot of buildings, and that's KZUM radio. It was KZUM radio and a whole lot of dead pigeons were on the upper floors of the building, but it's going to then come down. It'll be finally raised in this area, the same area when it came down, and it will become Union Savings, or Lincoln Federal Savings and Loan, excuse me. And that building is still there, but I don't think Lincoln Federal Savings and Loan occupies it. It's directly to the north of St. Paul Methodist Church. I'm not sure who's in it today. The building is still there. Billingsley himself was in the city council 1885 and 1887, which was a pivotal year for the city of Lincoln, as that's point where it reached a division point or a magic point of 50,000 people, which meant that it could be reincorporated then as a city of first class. Now at that point in time, with reincorporation, all the city offices were vacated, and then the people who were in them were reappointed. That would be like, I suspicion, the chief of the fire department, the police department, and so forth. And they were mostly all reappointed. The one guy who didn't get reappointed was a man by the name of Judge Albert Parsons. And he was rather notoriously famous for accepting monies in payment in lieu of fines, let's say, for things like gambling and prostitution. The money would be filtered through him, and somehow an awful lot of it never got into the city coffers. It sort of stuck to his pocket. So he was not rehired when the city reincorporated. But he didn't like that, interestingly enough. So he went to St. Louis and had a federal injunction prohibiting the city council from firing him. So he literally filed suit against the city because they fired him for being a scoundrel and misappropriating city funds. Interesting. At any rate, what this happens then is the federal court, do they or do they not have jurisdiction becomes a question. And Mr. Lamberson and his partner was Mr. Billingsley, who was on the city council, said, the federal government has no jurisdiction over you. They can haul you into court, but they have no jurisdiction. Well, nonetheless, the mayor and the council, on advice of council, ignored the federal restraining order, and guess what? They were arrested and taken to Omaha, the entire city council and the mayor, and placed in jail.
Wow.
Yeah. Lambertson, the attorney, then for the city, quickly took a train to Washington, D.C., where he conferred with President Grover Cleveland, who said he would personally come, if needed, and appear for them, if necessary. They released the mayor and those city councilmen who were still in jail. A couple of them had sort of pled out. They had various reasons. They just didn't want to spend the night in jail. So they came back to Lincoln. But ultimately went to the Supreme Court, and they found in favor of the Lincoln City Council, and home rule prevailed. That, I think, is a pretty good place, John. I think we're at 5 minutes. So we have, or 4 minutes, we have time for questions. And as I always like to say, there's plenty of time for corrections, but unfortunately, no time for corrections.
We're going to.
Yeah. Any questions? Comments? If not, we could pick this. Go ahead.
Yeah, going back to the beginning, when you talked about the roundhouse just northeast of the old depot, where would that be now? What would be there now?
What would be there now? It would probably be on the university campus. I think the university has come in and occupied that land. I'm looking at Ed to see if he got a better idea. There was a fire in that roundhouse, and with the fire we see just behind it in the next block is where the law school would be. So I'm guessing that now it would be, if you can see where the law school used to be and where, you know, where the architecture school is now, it would have been about a block to the, maybe a block and a half to the west of there, something like that. Is that, Ed, is that fairly accurate?
It might be 7th and S, it might be under the arena.
More 7th Street though, a little bit further west than that then. That general area. And that was one of the areas that they had a time cleaning up at one point in time, because there was a lot of spillage, not just oil, but also explosives, because the railroad they had a powder magazine in that area as well, maybe even more than one. But not much would have been there. And it would have been then not too far from Godfrey's Elevator, which was just to the west of what's now Pinnacle Arena, right, almost its footprint would have been right there. So it would have been right in that general area. Not a very good answer, but the best I can do. Another question? If not, we could be adjourned and we could pick this up. We do have a couple of things we could pick up next time, or we will pick it up and to be announced. Okay?